Hello and welcome to this month's gallery talk. Once again, Rebecca Albiani is here to offer us delight and enlightenment with a tour by sharing her deep understanding of art history. The contemporary example she will talk about today is the international artist and art star, or maybe I should say stardust, since I say starchitect for the architects. Kehinde Wiley, anyway. Before I get out of her way and let her tell you Mr. Wiley's fascinating story, I want to say a couple of quick thank yous. First, thank you to all of you for showing the interest and coming here. And then many, many thanks to Rebecca for visiting us several times this year and helping us get the Gallery Talks program off the ground after the disruptions of COVID and the reconstruction of Anderson Hall. The pain of all that fades now, especially after Rebecca has given us a splendid visit with Peggy Guggenheim and a new and unusual perspective on other important artists, Bill Traylor and the Gee's Bend Quilters, and the interplay of mental health and creativity for Jacob Lawrence and Vincent van Gogh. Not to mention the bonus lecture that she and the Seattle Perugia Sister City Committee provided to us in May. We will take August off, no gallery talk next month, and be back in fall with a changing set of artists' talks by a number of local artists. And Rebecca will be back next year, bringing us some additional adventures in art history. And now, Rebecca.
Welcome, everyone. I thought I would get right into Kehinde Wiley's most famous work as a way of introducing us to this artist. It is the work for which Wiley is best known, the presidential portrait of Barack Obama that is hanging in the National Portrait Gallery, but that has also gone on tour. I think actually at the moment it is in Chicago. And it has gone on tour, sorry, my notes, to tremendous fanfare all around the country, particularly young people of color have visited museums to see this work. And I am happy to acknowledge that it's possible that there may be some of you here in the audience for whom a picture of President Obama surrounded by flowers does not produce a feeling of reverence and general well-being. And if that's you, that's okay. I'm glad you're here for this talk, especially. It's important to note that this work is an anomaly within Wiley's career. As we'll see, he usually inserts anonymous, everyday men, and sometimes women of color, into the settings and poses of power he finds in the Western art historical tradition from the Renaissance to the Gilded Age. But when, as he said, he was asked to go to the White House to interview for a gig in 2016, that gig was painting a black man who inhabited an unprecedented position of power and fame on the world stage. Wiley's job was to convey the intelligence, the grace, and the humanity behind that power. He and Obama found they had some things in common. Both of them were the product of an absent African father and an American mother. White in Obama's case, African American in Wiley's. They both later traveled to Africa to find out more about their heritage, but were raised here by single mothers. They both had postgraduate degrees from the Ivy League, and they had both achieved extraordinary success in their respective fields. Now, also not characteristic of Wiley's work is the foliage background Usually he adapts his backgrounds from the decorative arts tradition, but here it seems much more alive, and the foliage and flowers are symbolic. African blue lilies referring to Obama's Kenyan father. Jasmine to his childhood in Hawaii, and then chrysanthemums are the official flower of Chicago. And you'll note, and this was actually a criticism of the work, that Obama sits rather uncomfortably on the edge of a hard Federalist-style chair. And that 6 years in office has put a great deal of gray into his hair. But those are both things that are testimonies to the difficulties of his position as the first African-American president. Now, he was not the first president to ask an African-American artist to paint his portrait. The credit for that goes to Bill Clinton, who had Simi Knox paint his White House official portrait. And here I show you the previous two presidential White House portraits. The Wiley one is not the White House one, but it is the National Portrait Gallery one. But the difference is that these works were both painted by portraitists. And that's sort of a niche within the art world. These are artists who are never going to appear in a survey of important artists, and these two paintings of white men in ties and suits are pretty instantly forgettable. Whereas the Obama portrait is indelible. It is a work of art by an important contemporary artist. And it has introduced a new generation of Americans, young Americans, to the artist and to the idea, with both artist and subject, that anything is possible for a young man of color in this country. Now, Kehinde Wiley does not paint self-portraits, although he invites us to consider his entire oeuvre as a sort of surrogate self-portrait. This is about the closest he comes. It was a photo shoot for the cover of Flaunt magazine, where he gives himself the kind of decorative background and extravagant costuming that he usually places his models in. And one of the reasons that Wiley loves the glamour is that he did not grow up with it. He grew up in South Central Los Angeles. His family had very little resources, but his mother put him and his twin brother into after-school art programs while she was still at work, so that they had a place to hang out that was not the streets. Now obviously Wiley excelled in these art programs, which also included visits to local museums. And the one that he adored most was the Huntington Library, Art Collections and Gardens in San Marino, with its collection of British portraits in the grand manner, including Gainsborough's famous Blue Boy. Yet it was very obvious the moment someone like Wiley walks into this room that there is no space here for black bodies. That this is an exclusively white, privileged enclave. And for those of you who might say, well, all lives matter, I encourage you to think about our cultural institutions, places like museums, the opera, the symphony, places that historically have not been open and welcoming to those who were non-white and non-wealthy. And if you see a black figure in a 17th or 18th century British painting, it's almost always a servant, if not a slave. So Wiley fell in love with this kind of painting, and yet he also wanted to criticize it for its lack of inclusion. Now, he has described it as horribly important to him that when he was 16, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art purchased and hung this painting by Carrie James Marshall, who also grew up in Los Angeles, now a Chicago-based artist. The style. This painting that Wiley said, quote, literally changed my life, end quote. It is a big painting. It's 10 feet wide. And to see this on the wall, this painting of an important black cultural space, the barber shop, of this sort of black self-representation with the elaborate hairdos, but also with all of the knowledge of the Western art historical tradition, a lot of visual puns here, right down to the name of this work, De Stijl, which plays on De Stijl, the 1920s artistic movement out of the Netherlands, whose most famous artist is Mondrian. And there's something of the black and white grid with primary colors behind this work. And this showed Wiley that anything was possible, that a career for him in the arts was possible. And so he would get his BFA at the San Francisco Art Institute, where he really honed his craft as an oil painter. And then for his MFA, he was recruited by the star-making program at Yale, which he said was more about ideas than practice, more about theory, gender, race, class, sexuality. And one of the works that he painted at Yale was this #1 Eminence from his Conspicuous Fraud series. This is a painting of a black man in the same kind of suit and tie that we saw Bill Clinton and George Bush wearing, but looking distinctly ill at ease in this costume of white male power. And in fact, his hair refuses to be constrained. His hair is unruly. It takes over the canvas. Its tendrils curl in front of him, almost as if they are grabbing him, holding him back, making him feel that as a black professional, he did not belong. So also at Yale, a work that he revisited in 2016, he created an hour-long video he called Smile, in which he asked young black men to come to his studio and be videoed smiling for an hour. And 4 at a time are present on the video. It took 17 sitters to do this because you can't smile for an hour. And this is about the experience of being a black man in a majority white culture, deeply imbued with white supremacism, having to look polite and happy and non-threatening, and the toll that that can take. Now, he also would receive a fellowship immediately after finishing Yale to be artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And Harlem was a tremendous change of pace, both from Yale and from South Central, because of the street culture. In LA, everyone gets in a car. But in Harlem, there were young men, as Wiley put it, peacocking all along the street, sharing their inimitable sense of style. He also, at that time, picked up a discarded mugshot from the street. He pinned it to his studio wall, and he didn't paint it for about 4 years, but he thought about it. It percolated in his mind the fact that portraiture, which he loved, generally excluded people that looked like him, whose only official portrait was often likely to be a mugshot. And so in 2006, he painted this mugshot of this young man with his sense of style, with those multiple necklaces around his neck. And he was very aware that he was not the first artist to use mugshots as inspiration, that in fact Andy Warhol in 1964 had done a whole series he called Most Wanted Men. And Warhol, I think, is a really important touchstone for Wiley. Warhol would develop a studio where he had physical help with his art making. Warhol was, like Wiley, a gay man. So Most Wanted Men is a double entendre. Yes, these men are wanted by the FBI, but they're also quite desirable. And we could say the same of Wiley with his mugshot study. So he's thinking about portraiture and thinking about young men in Harlem. And after the Studio Museum show, he had several galleries wanting to represent him, and he went with the Jeffrey Deitch Gallery. His first show with Deitch he called Faux Real. Another play on words for faux real, but he created that enormous ceiling painting that mimics what we Renaissance scholars call dal sotto in su, the perspective of Renaissance and Baroque paintings that try to make us believe that we're looking up not at a ceiling but at the sky, and the figures are floating above us. But here the figures are young black men, one visible only from about the crotch down, in street clothes. And then there are the candlesticks. There's the drama of any Kehinde Wiley gallery show. And the works on the walls all had religious inspiration behind them. So he began to find young men who were willing to pose for him in the guises of paintings from the past. So we don't know who this model is. The title tells us female prophet Anne, who observes the presentation of Jesus in the temple. So in art history, Anne is amazed that she is in the presence of her Savior. She's an elderly woman. Here, it's a young black man in a Denver Broncos jersey, the colors of which inform the mandala-like background behind him, creating a sort of halo for this young man. So this was what Wiley calls his street casting process. He would sit on a corner, first in Harlem, then in Brooklyn, and when an attractive young man would come by, he would start chatting him up and ask if he was willing to come down to his studio and pose for a portrait. And at the studio, they would look through art books together and choose a pose together that Wiley would eventually photograph and work from the photograph. One of his most famous works is this Napoleon leading the army over the Alps. And probably you have seen the source material for this. It is Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon Crossing the Alps from 1801. So it's really interesting to look at the two together and see that there are certain things that Wiley copies very closely. The black and white horse, the pose of the horse, the pose of the rider, the yellow cloak, the rocks. But if you look closely, you can see that in the David, the rocks have names on them of Bonaparte, but also his predecessors in Alp crossing, Hannibal and Charlemagne. And that if you, can you see the Bonaparte, Hannibal? Here, Bonaparte has Williams added. Williams being the surname of the young black man posing for Wiley. And Wiley actually brought a horse into his studio and learned that the proportions are off in old master equestrian portraits. That to make the rider seem more powerful, the dimensions of the horse are modified. And so he had to kind of Photoshop that. But when we look at the garb of the young black man, he's wearing a sweatband instead of a glove. He is wearing military garb, camouflage. But it's not because he's in the military, it's because it's a fashion statement to go with his Timberland boots. And the background, instead of the mountains, has a decorative motif that is drawn from empire-style interior design. A wallpaper that might have been in a Napoleonic apartment with red and gold. But because this work is about male posturing, about masculinity, maybe even about toxic masculinity, that drive to conquer, Wiley has interspersed the background with thousands of little sperm. And there are also sperm decorating the frame that Wiley designed for this work. And here too, Wiley is alluding to the tradition of the history of art, being very aware of Edvard Munch's Madonna, which similarly has sperm swimming around the edges of the frame. Here we see his equestrian portrait from the same show, Rumors of War, equestrian portrait of the Count Duke Olivares from 2005, where he really had to reduce the size of the horse to make it look right. And where we have a young man wearing a sword, something that you're not allowed to walk around Brooklyn with. That's a weapon, but a weapon of a very different time. And again, we see the exuberant Baroque decoration in the background in this work drawn from Velázquez. In 2006, he was asked by the Columbus Museum of Art to create a work based on a work in their own collection when he had a show there. And he chose to base his portrait on a 17th century Dutch portrait, quite small, of Andries Stilton. And the pose is arrogant. This is what we call the Renaissance elbow. It's a pose that was developed in the Renaissance. It's a power pose, that elbow sticking straight out at us. But Wiley and his model take it up a notch. They move the walking stick out farther. The arm is extended. The head is thrown back. They're both really playing with these ideas of posing in that powerful pose. Now, another of the works for that Rumors of War series, and one of the works that Wiley calls his very favorite, or among his very favorite works, is based on this Charles Le Brun painting. So Lebrun was the official portrait painter or the official painter for Louis XIV, here painting a high official at Louis's court at the entry of Louis XIV into Paris in 1660. So this is a man of tremendous power, surrounded by beautiful young men, his pages, his attendants, their long hair and their bows and their brocade, and they hold up parasols above the chancellor. The Wiley looks like this. So again, it's a young man surrounded by attractive young men holding up the parasols and what have you, but in their own kind of, their own clothes, the ones that they chose to present themselves in at Wiley's studio. And I just had to throw this in because it's such a funny photograph, but in 2013, Wiley was photographed painting on horseback in his studio, again inviting the horses into the studio, but it's just so funny. And there's a tremendous amount of humor in a lot of Wiley's work. Well, in 2007, or rather 2006, after Columbus, Wiley traveled to Beijing. And he fell in love with a Chinese man, learned Chinese, and established a second studio in Beijing. And this is something that he has been criticized for. In fact, Rush Limbaugh, when he was alive, posted a picture of the Obama portrait with "Made in China" stamped on it because of this link to Chinese labor, which Wiley is playing with in his China works. This one uses not a Western work of art for its source material, but a communist propaganda poster that had text that said, "Acting in accordance with Chairman Mao's instructions means victory." And so here Wiley is painting black men in China, who, as is the case with many black men in the United States, were primarily in service positions in China. They were janitors. They were given the most humble sorts of work to do. But Wiley is, painting the flesh, painting the faces, as in fact he is doing here. It's his assistants who are painting the backgrounds that here come from Chinese art, not Western decorative art. But virtually every successful artist who works on a large scale uses assistants. Here are a couple of assistants working on a big Jeff Koons painting. And this is not new. Raphael had a team of assistants. Rembrandt had a team of assistants. Rubens had a team of assistants. It doesn't make sense for a conceptual artist like Kehinde Wiley. It's just not the best use of his time to be painting every, stippling on every fruit in the background of his work. And historically, the argument, oh, he did not paint that himself, he did not create that himself, is one that has been used not for Jeff Koons. No one's criticizing Anselm Kiefer for using an assistant, but for marginalized groups that wish to break into the art world. So when Harriet Hosmer showed Zenobia in Chains in 1859, she was accused of not doing her own carving. And in fact, she didn't. She had a team of marble carvers. She made the model in wax or in clay, and her carvers executed it in marble. But that was the way that every neoclassical stone carver worked. Hiram Powers, William Wetmore's story, no one was criticizing the men for using assistants. Only of the woman was it said she did not do her own work. The experience in China opened up Wiley's mind to the global African diaspora, and he began to work all over the world, and he went to Africa itself, where this work was made in Senegal. And in Senegal, everyone is black. So putting black individuals into the poses of art, here using that wooden statue that's now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art of a Dogon couple, 19th century work, putting black people, black faces, is not so radical in Seneca. What's radical there is putting two gay men, because there are a number of African countries in which homosexuality is illegal, punishable by jail sentences. And so these are daring images of young black couples that he's making in Africa. In Brazil, he depicted, we'll deal with that later, he depicted two young men that he met there in the pose of two fallen heroes in a well-known public monument to a pioneer Brazilian aviator, Alberto Santos Dumont, which you see there at the bottom. So this is, I think it's supposed to be a plane crash, and then above is a figure of Santos Dumont, but these two young men appear in the poses of the fallen. And Wiley calls the work the father of aviation. But we see this work is huge. It's 15 feet wide. It's like billboard size. It's well over life size. It's really, really powerful to see these young men on that scale. The same is true for the woman bit by a serpent or a snake. The title Wiley gives us in French, it's a title of the statue in the Musée d'Orsay that he uses as his source material. Again, using a statue instead of a painting. And you can see that although the woman is naked and the man is not, that we do get some flesh around his waist, that his jeans are pulled down to show us his underwear, that the bottoms of his sneakers are in exactly the same position of the soles of the feet of the woman bitten by a serpent. Now, in Western art, we have lots of reclining nudes. Women, reclining female nudes. We don't have a lot of reclining male nudes or reclining men at all. And so Wiley is allowing these gorgeous young men to lounge around in his painting. Now his first opportunity to paint a real celebrity was this one. His equestrian portrait of King Philip II, Michael Jackson. And it is based on a posthumous equestrian portrait by Rubens of Philip II on horseback. And I just want to go back for a moment so you get the whole thing, and can see that, yes, this is Michael Jackson. And he didn't meet Michael Jackson. They only corresponded, and Jackson sent photographs for him to work from. But when Wiley said he was thinking about Rubens, Jackson said, well, do you mean early Rubens or late Rubens? So he was really well aware. So I want us to look closely at the choices Wiley makes, because the portrait was finished after Jackson's death. And he might not have approved of all of the changes. For one thing, the horse is no longer a brown horse. The horse starts out brown at the rear end and the legs. But as you get closer to the head, the horse gets whiter. And Michael Jackson, of course, famously underwent multiple plastic surgeries and bleaching procedures to make his own features whiter. Instead of a voluptuous woman crowning him, there are two putti children. This is an uncomfortable detail knowing what we know about Michael Jackson, but one of them white, one of them black, and near the forepaw of the animal we see a poppy plant. And poppies are symbolic in Western art of sleep, of death, but also produce the opium that helped to kill Michael Jackson. So it's a fascinating portrait of one of the most famous black men of the 20th century. And I'm not sure Jackson would have been completely thrilled by it. He got a chance the year later to paint someone as famous as Michael Jackson, just not to us. The footballer Samuel Eto'o from Cameroon. And Wiley was astonished by the culture of celebrity around soccer internationally. And so Puma had hired him to make this series of portraits of soccer players for the World Cup of 2012. Wiley described the power that these men had as saying, quote, nothing like, or I've experienced a type of American celebrity, but nothing like we experience in West Africa. There is a sense in which these men occupy a type of power, a type of grace that can only be seen in a community environment, end quote. So here he's depicting these beautiful, powerful, famous young men for an audience who recognizes them immediately. His global project took him to Israel next. So by this time, Wiley is calling these works the world stage. And in Israel, he sought out Ethiopian Jews involved in making hip-hop. And he was fascinated by how hip-hop, this local New York phenomenon, had become something international. Something that united people all over the world. For the backgrounds, he used Mizrah works, cut paper works from the Jewish tradition. He used internet images for most of them, but it turned out that many of them were in the Jewish Museum in New York City, and so he was later able to exhibit his portraits with the actual source material, which was very exciting for him. In 2012, he did his very first series that involved women. And he was asked, why did it take you so long to paint women? And he said, well, because I'm not one. I'm not in a woman's body, so it took him longer. And he did this a little differently. Whereas for his usual street casting, he would sit on a street corner in Brooklyn, but that seemed predatory when he was going to, he was going to try to find female models. So he had one of his studio assistants, a white woman, help him. In fact, the woman who posed for the head, help him gain the trust of these women he was meeting on the streets, that he felt that he was struck by their beauty, their grace, their magnificence. So he contracted with them to pose for him, but he didn't have them wear their own clothes. For this series, he collaborated with Riccardo Tisci at Givenchy, the fashion house, who designed multi-thousand-dollar dresses for these women to don in Wiley's paintings. And this one is, I think, the standout from this collection, but also provoked a lot of controversy. Again, when the Obama portrait commission was announced, this was trotted out as an example of Wiley promoting black violence against white people. Well, this is not what this painting is about. This is Judith and Holofernes, which is, I wasn't able to get an image of the source for this, but when Seattle Art Museum showed this work just before the pandemic, there were no protesters saying, Sam is advocating violence against men. It is a part of the apocryphal tradition in the Hebrew Bibles. Well, it's not actually written in Hebrew; it's complicated, but it's part of the Book of Judith is part of Jewish tradition and what Catholics call the Old Testament. And it involves an Israelite heroine whose people are threatened, and so she manages to earn the trust of the enemy general and to cut off his head with his own sword. And is acclaimed as a great hero. So she's one of the few strong, active women that we see in Renaissance and Baroque painting. And what is she doing here with a white woman's head? Well, what I think this painting is about is standards of beauty. That Judith here is decapitating a white woman because that is what our society believes is beautiful. Studies have been done, psychological studies, that show that even African Americans have been culturally programmed to prefer images of white people, to find them more attractive, hence Michael Jackson. When this woman was a child, it might have been very difficult to find dolls that looked like her, to read books about people that looked like her, and so forth. So she is killing, beheading, not a woman, But the whole idea that blondes have more fun, that only women of European descent are beautiful, desirable, and she stands before us, this magnificent figure, powerful, tall, grasping a sword in one hand and a head in the other, to show us that no, this is not the only ideal of beauty. Wiley in 2013 did a series of works that were more small devotional portraits based on, well, a work that he thought was by Memling. It has since been reattributed to Quentin Metzys, but you can see that the pose is similar, that Wiley has created the frame and the gold, recreated the gold writing on the blue ground, but wants us to think about Christianity, about holiness, about who we see as donors, patrons of art, and who we see as saints in the Western tradition. So a 2014 series creates tabernacles, gilded frames. This one has the name of the sitter right on the frame, Kellen Scantlebury. But it is in the pose of a king and the high priest from, honestly, I don't know what work of art. But the fascinating thing about this one is that Wiley reveals his process to us. Because this is probably the pose from the original painting that he's used as a source, but in the man's other hand, he holds a book, perhaps a Bible in the original painting, but here, it's an art history book. It is Raphael's St. Cecilia altarpiece that he has opened it to, and almost certainly the sitter and Wiley decided that that was what they were going to show. And so Wiley is introducing these young men to the history of art. They are leafing through art history books together, and then he's inserting them in the history of art. The portrait of Lady Killigrew, Mary Hill, takes a 17th century work by Van Dyck as its source material, and uses for its background a design inspired, by the work of William Morris, which you can see in the inset at the upper left. And in these works, Wiley was a little bit cagey. He said, not all of my women were born women. And so this may be a transgender woman, but it doesn't matter, she's a woman. And the use of the William Morris is really interesting to me. Morris was the famous arts and crafts designer in England, for 2.5 centuries later than Van Dyck. So it's not a background that is from the era of this portrait in the lower left, the way that, say, the Napoleonic background was from the era of David. Instead, he's choosing William Morris, very deliberately, I think, because Morris was a socialist. And one of Morris's quotes is mirrored by something that Wiley has said. Wiley has said, quote, "Let's face it, I make really high-priced luxury goods for wealthy consumers," end quote, which sounds a little bit like William Morris's complaint that, quote, "I spend my life ministering to the swinish luxury of the rich," end quote. And I think in both cases, they have a populist streak. They want their work available to the masses, and yet it's being snapped up by very wealthy collectors, but sometimes museums. like the Seattle Art Museum that owns this work, an Anthony of Padua, that includes on the military-style jacket a Black Panther patch that was worn by the 66th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army in World War II. But it also, of course, conjures up the Black Panther Party. And yet St. Anthony is famous for his will towards peace. Wiley began to work in other media, one of which was stained glass. He doesn't create the stained glass, he creates the designs, and then he outsources it to a historic stained glass manufactory in Bohemia. But here it is Mary, the Comforter of the Afflicted, that he titles this work, which is a pietà. That image of Mary holding the body of her crucified son. But instead, we find a young black man holding the body of a dead black child. An image that we have seen too many times in this society, whether from drive-by shootings, from police violence, from death by asthma and other things that are disproportionately suffered by people of color. They both wear halos, and surrounding them are instances of oppression. The American Indian in the upper right, the man with the chains of slavery, but possibly also images of hope. Wiley began making sculpture around the same time. This work was shown in his show at Seattle Art Museum, Bound. It's another work that features women's busts, and their hair, the hair of these three women interweaves, intertwines, tangles together. Here, Wiley is touching on the feminine version of what Carrie James Marshall was painting in that barbershop scene. The women's hair salons that braid black women's hair, that treat it, that add extensions, that create this culture of black women's hair and hair care, something that they are immensely proud of, but that separates them from white culture, as Serena and Venus Williams found when they tried to wear beads at Wimbledon. A more recent sculpture is Rumors of War from 2019, which has been installed at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, where there is a street that is just filled with Confederate, or was just filled with statues of Confederate generals. And here it was a statue of J.E.B. Stuart fighting to uphold slavery that Wiley uses to model his figure on. You can see from this image of the people installing it, that's why I'm showing you this one, how large this figure is. Can you see human scale here? So it's immense. And it was shown in Times Square before it was installed. This is a close-up view of it. But we see this proud young man with his braids and his threadbare jeans and his hoodie. But we also see his self-confidence, his excellent horsemanship, the way he pulls in the reins, the way he masters this animal. Wiley said, quote, "I want this to be about black men and their place in society, a society that can say yes to black men," end quote. And the mayor of Richmond said, quote, "It's taken more than 100 years, but the rest of Richmond residents finally have a monument of a man on a horse who looks like them," end quote. And Wiley has commented that he would like to see more empty plinths in places like Richmond. In 2017, he painted this Ship of Fools, which he called a work that gets him out of his comfort zone and into the irrational. So the source material is the Narrenschip tradition, the Ship of Fools tradition. We see the Hieronymus Bosch painting at the right from this tradition, a ship that's growing, a little boat really, that's growing a tree. But when we replace the white figures with black ones, there are a lot of other references that begin piling up. We imagine refugees. We imagine the Middle Passage and slavery. And Wiley is inviting us to think of works of art like Winslow Homer's The Gulf Stream, a rare example of a white American artist featuring a black hero in one of his paintings, but a black hero who's probably doomed in this image. Wiley would also create a 3-channel film on this Ship of Fools theme. He is going back and forth then between sculpture and film and glass and paint. Here painting Alexander Cassatt, the brother of Mary Cassatt, but the head of a railroad in Pennsylvania, and replacing the staid, Edwardian figure with the brilliant, fashionable figure in the oval frame. In 2018, Wiley went to Tahiti, partly to apologize for Gauguin, and created a series of images of the Mahu community in Tahiti, which consider themselves of a third gender, between male and female. And so they challenge Gauguin's sexualization of teenage Polynesian beauties for the delectation of the European viewer. And in fact, in these works, he does not have them pose in the poses of Western paintings, but allows them to choose their own poses and uses the traditions of Tahitian decorative arts for the backgrounds. Well, around this time, Wiley was developing a studio in Dakar, in Senegal. We see him here with his architect. It was Wiley's dream to create his own artist's residency. So at his studio, there is his own studio, but also 3 studios for artists in residence who come from between 1 to 3 months. They can learn French, they can immerse themselves in the cultural life of Dakar, they can take lessons in Wolof, the local language, and he chose to isolate in Dakar in 2020 when the world shut down. So we see him here surrounded by some of his paintings. But later that year, he did a series of images, or possibly he had done these before COVID struck, but the images were shown at the William Morris Gallery in London, which is not in the heart of London. It's in a more diverse part of London. He used Londoners as his models, and Kwana Noble seems to be being consumed by the wallpaper, by the honeysuckle design, which is a Morris and Company print that I'm sure Wiley knew was designed not by William, but by his daughter May Morris, an underrepresented figure, being foregrounded here, but also the fact that in the Western portrait tradition, you might find someone standing at the edge of their lands, with their estate behind them. Here, this woman's background is threatening to choke her, and I think that's significant. More recently, and if you get to San Francisco in I think the next few weeks, you can see an exhibition at the De Young Museum of Wiley's work that is in response to violence against people of color, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, in response to police violence. He has returned here to the other side of that figure of the woman bitten by a serpent, here Mamadou Gueye. He's painting these in Senegal with Senegalese models. The death of Hyacinth, Nde Bouri Mbou, is from a Tiepolo painting. And he wants us to meditate on death, on loss, on the fact that so many young black men in particular never make it to adulthood. Whether that's through death, through prison, they never become fully themselves. Now, I do want to address another criticism of Wiley, which is that he's a one-trick pony, a sellout, someone who just keeps doing the same thing over and over because he's found that he's the darling of the art world and it's making him a lot of money. And I hope that looking at the sculptures and just a bit of the video and so forth shows that he is moving in other directions. But it's really important to remember that initial project of his, which was to make images of black bodies in the portrait style of Van Dyck and Gainsborough, and to bring black people onto the walls of the museum where they can inspire young people of color. And you cannot do that, you cannot accomplish that project without getting your work onto the walls of museums, which is a spectacularly difficult thing for a contemporary artist to do. You have to be making a lot of money to be purchased by the Brooklyn Museum, the Getty, Seattle Art Museum, and so forth. And he had to pay his dues. He had to learn to paint like an old master. And so in this particular work, we see that he's used another William Morris background. And my favorite quote from William Morris is, quote, "I do not want art for a few, any more than education for a few or freedom for a few," end quote. And if we replace a few with wealthy white people, Wiley does not want art for just the 1%, any more than he wants education for only white people, or freedom for only white people. He wants it to extend to all. So his work is inclusive. His work says black is powerful, black is beautiful. And he has, in fact, come full circle. because this painting, his portrait of a young gentleman, now hangs to inspire the next generation across from the Blue Boy in the Thornton Portrait Gallery in the Huntington in Santa. Thank you. Happy to take questions. I think someone may have a microphone to bring around. If there are questions or works of art you would like a second look at.
Thank you, that was very inspiring. I wasn't here when you first introduced the background of these paintings. Why the flowers?
Why the flowers? Well, he started with, and let me just sort of go a long way back. He started with decorative backgrounds. So this is an early one, and they're more like wallpaper. They're more drawn from decorative arts. And this one is specifically drawn from Napoleonic era, empire style, wallpaper, interior decor, fabric design, and so forth. So here it's complementing the style of the painting that he's drawing on as a background. So why use that and not use the actual background? I think it's one of his ways of saying this is a luxury good, that it differentiates these works from the works that they are drawn from. I think he likes the patterns. And then in a lot of cases, not this one so much, but the patterns start to take over. And that is, I think he wants us to think about backgrounds and think about how people are sometimes trapped by their backgrounds, or that their backgrounds are something sticky that has tendrils that can lock them in place if they are not very careful. And so I think that that's another reason that he uses these decorative backgrounds. I think he also likes flowers, but the William Morris ones, well, here he's using a Chinese style background, but the William Morris ones, let me find a good Morris background. That's Morris-esque. This is a good Morris background. I think he is deliberately drawing on partly because I love William Morris. I think he's deliberately drawing on Morris, on the tensions in William Morris between wanting to create work for the masses, wanting to elevate the masses, wanting to give his workers good salaries and good living conditions, and wanting to make things that they could actually have in their homes, and continually falling short of that, and finding that to make things the way he wanted them made, handmade with natural dyes, was expensive. And so he was pandering to the very wealthy. And in that same way, I think Wiley wants to make works that will be seen by kids. He wants it to be, in a way, popular art. But he makes works that are very, very expensive, that end up largely in the private collections of the 1%.
Does he paint the background or does other?
No, other people. So he has assistants, and there is an image, not of his assistants, but of a couple of assistants working on a Jeff Koons. He doesn't paint the backgrounds. He doesn't do every dot. He comes up with the backgrounds, but someone else actually executes it, just the same way that Raphael did not paint all of his backgrounds either. So he uses a studio, he uses assistants, and he has been criticized for that in a way that ignores how many great artists in the Western tradition have utilized assistants. Other questions? Oh, yeah.
I'm taken by the scale that he wants to work, and it's so large that it is a phenomenon in itself. That is, its psychological impact is inevitable, like going into one of the great cathedrals.
Yes.
And with it, it's intent. And is that like it's in your face kind of thing that
Yes,
you cannot deny the power
cannot
of this.
avoid it. You are confronted with it. This work is huge. It's 90 inches high. That's what, 8 feet high. So each face is this big. This is 25 feet wide. It's enormous. And I think this work was at Seattle Art Museum. And it had a tremendous impact. It just, when you work that big, the abstract expressionists knew this, you work that big and it has a visceral impact. So, yeah, welcome. Yes?
One of the portraits has keys as a background pattern.
Yes.
Any thoughts about why?
Was it this one?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Do I have any thoughts about why? I don't exactly. I know that Wiley is using, for the backgrounds of these Cameroon images, he's using local textiles for his background inspiration. I do not know if there is an actual textile design that has keys, or if it's just the blue and the green that is more the actual design, and the keys symbolize something else, but I really don't have a good guess. But they come onto his body, and keys are sort of a lucky thing, and this guy has a lot of them. He can open a lot of doors with his talent, so maybe that's why. But I don't know for certain. Well, thank you all so much for being here.